Okay, let's just jump right in. In today's explainer, we're unpacking one of the most tragic and honestly deeply misunderstood stories to come out of the Philippine-American War. We are looking at the life, the resistance, and the ultimate betrayal of Macario Sakay. It's a fascinating look at how historical narratives are shaped and how a nation's fiercest patriot was basically erased from the history books as a common criminal, only to be vindicated decades later.
So right off the bat, we're faced with a really profound contradiction. Think about this. How does a legitimate revolutionary, a guy who actually built and led a functioning government, end up executed on the gallows as a simple thief and murderer? Well, to figure out how that happened, we have to look at exactly who Macario Sakay was and what he completely refused to do when the rest of his country's leadership just gave up.
All right, to set the stage, let's go back to the year 1901. Emilio Aguinaldo, who was the leader of the official Filipino Republic, had been captured and pledged allegiance to the United States. Following his lead, a ton of the top officers and wealthy leaders surrendered, and the American government officially declared the war over. But Macario Sakay, he wasn't having it. He completely refused to accept defeat. He firmly believed that a foreign nation had absolutely no right to govern the Filipino people. For him, surrendering meant abandoning the revolution entirely.
Now, what you really need to understand is that the later years of the revolution were defined by a really stark divide. On one hand, you had the Magdalo faction. These were the wealthy elites and political establishment figures who eventually compromised with the Americans. But on the other side, you had Sakay's faction. Sakay actually grew up in poverty. He was a grassroots, working-class native of Tondo, Manila. We're talking about a guy who worked as an apprentice in a carriage workshop, a tailor, a barber, and even a stage actor in traditional Filipino plays. And actually, that experience performing in plays made him an incredibly charismatic public speaker and recruiter for the resistance.
And his revolutionary roots? They ran incredibly deep. In 1894, he joined Andres Bonifacio's Katipunan, which was the original secret revolutionary society. That means he was out there fighting fearlessly against the Spanish Empire long before the wealthy elites ever took control of the revolution. He was a trusted fighter who organized units, gathered supplies, and really built a reputation as a fearless commander right from the very beginning. As he kept up his guerrilla campaign against the Americans, Sakay became visually famous for his long hair. According to popular lore, he and his men made a strict vow that they would never cut their hair until the Philippines finally achieved its independence. Now, whether that was a formal vow or just, the reality of living rough in the mountains, that long hair served as this powerful, enduring symbol of his unbroken resistance against foreign rule. Section 1. The Tagalog Republic, or the Republika ng Katagalogan. By 1902, Sakay wasn't just hiding out in the mountains trying to survive. He actually built a nation to replace the one that had surrendered. This wasn't some rogue criminal gang wandering around the jungle. Sakay established the Republika ng Katagalalugan, the Tagalog Republic. And, by the way, Tagalog in this context meant the entire Filipino nation. He drafted a constitution, served as president right alongside his vice president, Francisco Carreon. They had a cabinet, functioning courts, official documents, and even an organized system for tax collection. This was a highly organized shadow government that viewed itself as the legitimate continuation of the Philippine Republic. And his military structure was just as disciplined. His forces were definitely not a disorganized mob. They were formally divided into squads, companies, and battalions. They had designated branches like infantry, artillery, and medical services, complete with regulated uniforms. He even issued strict orders punishing any of his own men who abused civilians. This huge military apparatus was supported by loyal, brilliant generals like Julian Montalon and Cornelio Felizardo, who managed to coordinate attacks across multiple provinces. Because he shared his men's hardships, refused any luxury whatsoever, and utilized rapid jungle warfare, the American forces literally could not catch him. Sakay's forces were constantly shifting their bases across Rizal, Laguna, Cavite, and Batangas. They launched surprise attacks and ambushes, captured firearms, and pretty easily evaded the heavily armed Philippine constabulary. For years, he was a massive, humiliating problem for the American occupation. So, since they couldn't defeat him militarily, the colonial government decided to weaponize the law. They passed the Brigandage Act of 1902. This was an incredibly strategic, if devious, piece of legislation that allowed the U.S. to rebrand a war for independence into a mere police matter. It basically classified any armed resistance to U.S. rule as outright banditry, which completely denied political recognition to the fighters. So, in the eyes of the law, patriots defending their homeland were magically transformed into ladrones, or common bandits and thieves.
Moving on to Section 2, the trap in Cavite, deception and betrayal.
Realizing they still couldn't defeat Sakay in combat, the colonial government resorted to a massive deception to project to the rest of the world that the Philippines was completely pacified. They used a Filipino labor leader named Dominador Gomez as an intermediary. Gomez ventured into the mountains and offered Sakay this illusion of peace. He promised a general amnesty for Sakay and his men. But the real hook was that he promised if Sakay surrendered, the Americans would establish a Philippine National Assembly. Basically, a peaceful political path to independence, putting his country's future way above his own war. Sakay accepted. Watching the events of 1906 unfold, you can just feel the dread. In July, Sakay and his commanders descend from the mountains, and they're greeted by cheering crowds and brass bands who clearly still view them as absolute heroes. But then, on July 17th, they are invited to a town fiesta in Cavite. Right in the middle of the party, American officers and constabulary soldiers suddenly surround them, disarm them, and arrest them. The promise of amnesty was a complete lie. Sakay was thrown straight into Bilibid prison, tried under the Brigandage Act as a common murderer, and sentenced to death. On September 13, 1907, Macario Sakay was brought to the gallows. Standing right there before the hangman, while the American press was actively trying to cement his legacy as a simple criminal, he delivered these incredibly defiant final words. He directly, publicly rejected the false label the colonial government had slapped on him, calmly stating his intent and his patriotism. He died defending the mother country, praying that independence would eventually be born in the future. Which brings us to Section 3. A hero vindicated, modern recognition. So Sakay was hanged, and for decades after, American-era textbooks successfully painted him as an outlaw. But history eventually catches up with the truth. There is just a vast gulf between the colonial myth used to justify his execution and the reality of what he actually did. The colonial narrative desperately needed him to be a common bandit running a criminal enterprise of murderers and thieves. But the historical reality, backed by solid documentary evidence, is that he was the president of a republic, running a functioning government and acting as a legitimate military commander in a war for independence. Thankfully, the story absolutely does not end in disgrace. Today, historians and the nation have completely rehabilitated his image. He is now widely acknowledged as a legitimate revolutionary. The Philippine Senate has formally honored his contributions, public monuments proudly stand in his memory, and military facilities like Camp General Macario Sakay bear his name. Today, he is finally recognized as the last true general of the original Katipunan. I want to leave you with this provocative thought. The story of Macario Sakay proves that labels can be incredibly powerful weapons. So if history is initially written by the victors, encouraging us to see certain figures as criminals, you have to wonder, how many other bandits in our history books were actually patriots? It's a really good reminder to always question the historical narratives we are handed. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you think you know.